8 credits, 8 modules completed. To get the 2-year, you need 17 credits or modules completed. Now, if you've just come to everyone, then you're fine, right? But if you've missed one or something, or not submitted your assignment or something like that, we're giving you from now to the fall a period of grace to catch up on that, watch that video, read that book, do that assignment over the summer, so that you might, if you're only 1 credit short, get that extra certificate, okay? So praise the Lord for that. Also, we need to promote Barnabas. We've had a number of people along the whole 2-year journey. We're coming to the end of that. We need more people to enroll if we're going to continue it into the fall. Somebody was already expressing gratitude. We've got a good thing going. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We just want to keep offering this as a blessing to the churches. Pastor Steve and I and Val, from kind of the top down, we promote this and encourage pastors and things. And even at the local Feb Central meeting last week, Barnabas got a shout out. There was actually a picture from over there of us all sitting here, and it was shown to hundreds and hundreds of delegates all across the province. So that was pretty neat. But to allow this to keep going, we need you to promote it, encourage it amongst your friends and churches. Okay? So today we're pleased to have Scott Stein with us. And Scott Stein was a fellowship pastor. He sensed the Lord calling him into an apologetics ministry, and it's called Prepared to Answer. And we were very blessed at Markdale. We had Scott come up. It was probably two years ago now. And he started out doing kind of basic apologetics, and then with all of this gender and sexuality business going on, he's kind of had to specialize or felt called to specialize. He can share that a little bit later. But he's come here this morning to give an introduction to apologetics and to work through a number of those key questions that we might get as Christians in our life and ministry that we need to be prepared to answer. So we hope that, Scott, you'll enjoy us, we'll enjoy you, and that the Lord will bless you.
I hope so. Good. Thank you, Chris. Well, good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's good to be here. Boy, this is an ambitious project to be undertaking for a Saturday morning to do an introduction to apologetics. This is in the way. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to just take this off. I'll spin it around. Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, so God bless you. You've had coffee, I hope. Everyone, okay. I just want to do a brief introduction. I want to be mindful of our schedule and that we've got a fair bit of material to cover. But Chris gave me a brief introduction. Prepared to Answer is a ministry I began in 2012. Christian apologetics, Christian worldview training, partnering with local churches is kind of our sphere. Our mission really, though, this is my heartbeat, is I want to help a new generation think like Jesus. I'm interested in the formation of the Christian mind, Christian apologetics, Christian worldview. I think that all falls within that sphere, but of course it's much bigger than that because Jesus didn't the thinking of Jesus wasn't just a body of content. It's not just the content that formed Jesus' mind, but thinking involves not just what we think, but how we think about what we think and why we think it, right? Our heart, soul, body, mind all go into our being and who we are, and ultimately spiritual renewal, as the Apostle Paul said, comes through the renewing of our minds, by conforming our minds and how we think about the world, and then engage with it and interact with it, understanding our lives before God and the world we live in and the people around us through the lens of God's truth, renewing our mind and reshaping it according to the gospel, which is Genesis 1 to Revelation 22. So that's really the heartbeat of our mission. This is the team I get to work with. Sorry.
Can I just replace the batteries?
Sure. I am feeling kind of sluggish. I gotta be honest with you. Oh, the microphone. Anyway. Yeah, you bet. and maybe I'll say a little bit later, but we want to get underway. So our discussion this morning is an introduction to apologetics, and I want to be realistic in terms of what we can accomplish in a morning when entering into a field of study that's this big. So you don't feel like you'll need to walk away here as experts in any sense. My hope is, in terms of takeaway from this morning, my hope really is to whet your appetite, to develop a growing desire to learn more about Christian apologetics, and then also in terms of the introduction, making more familiar with you some of the common questions and maybe some of the key voices that are worth chasing down a little further. God's just blessed the church in terms of the number of capable men and women who are doing good works in the field of Christian apologetics, helping the church to give an answer in the culture we find ourselves today in our world. So, what is Christian apologetics, or what is apologetics? Well, the kind of our founding verse, and this is prepared to answer, is my ministry's name, and I didn't invent that. I stole it from Peter, and it really comes out of 1 Peter 3:15, which is Peter's admonition, and 16, admonition to the church. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to give an answer. And the Greek word there that Peter uses is apologia, right? So we just take that word and we've kind of used it then. Apologetics, it's not apologizing the way we think about saying sorry, rather it's giving a defense to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. But this is the second part of his admonition that I think is critically important when entering into the field of apologetics. But do this with gentleness and respect, right? Keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. One of my fears in terms of opening up the door to a Christian apologetics is often it's a very intellectual pursuit. And for some people, they just click with it. For some people, not so much. My fear is, however you enter into it, that it doesn't become a source of, it's not something that puffs us up, that can cause us to think of ourselves as maybe smarter than the next person we're going to be talking to. It is a part of complete Christian witness, where witness includes not only proclaiming what we believe, but also why we believe what we believe. But as such, it is the task of giving non-believers a reasoned explanation for why we hold the gospel. So that's really the role of apologetics as a discipline of preparing ourselves to not just tell people what we believe, but to explain and give reasons for why. And we can do that because the God we worship, the God we follow, is a reasonable God. He is intelligent, right? Our faith is not some blind leap in the dark. Our faith is in response to what our reasonable, rational Creator has revealed to us about His work and actions in the world. What it's not, it is not the art of arguing. And even though it may involve making an argument, this is something I think we really want to be careful of, and as I was kind of alluding to, and why I included verse 16 in Peter's admonition, that gentleness and respect, the manner in which we give an apologetic is just as important as the apologetic we make. Because giving the right answer in the wrong way, it's the wrong answer, right? So we want to be careful that we don't use it as some kind of an intellectual club to get the upper hand in a conversation, or to make people feel dumb. And in person it's maybe not as easy to do. But I do find online, it's very easy to be unkind and uncharitable and make arguments in a way to try and stick it to the person. And I think if that's how we seek to use apologetics, we're using it wrong. That's not what we want to do, nor do I think that serves Christ or honors Him. Jesus was often very severe in the things He said to His opponents, but He was never unkind. Right. So, what kind of reasoned explanations then does apologetics entail? And maybe I'll just hit the pause button for a second. I should give you maybe a set of expectations of We've got close to 10 of what I hope we'll cover in the first session and then towards the second. We're in the midst of a bit of an introduction right now. I want to then give you a brief historical overview of apologetics through history, starting at the early church, and then begin introducing you to some of the types of, or I guess the manners of apologetics, the way that apologetics are done, and then we'll get into some specific examples. It's a lot, so hang on to your hats, but I hope you'll enjoy it. So what kind of reasoned explanations do apologetic arguments entail? Well, to start off with, apologetics proceeds on the biblical assumption that wherever we may find truth, it is the Lord's. This is something that St. Augustine said in his work on Christian doctrines. So it's an assumption that if we simply engage the world reasonably, we're going to see God's truth, that God reveals his truth in, yes, certainly in Scripture we get God's special revelation, but God's truth is evident throughout life. Anywhere we find truth, it is the Lord's. Apologetics, therefore, engages many fields of study, including theology and philosophy, science, history, archaeology, art. I actually have a colleague who their speciality is art and apologetics, and also cultural anthropology, so looking at comparisons in culture. And this is, as Arthur Holmes, a philosopher, said, that all truth, because all truth is God's truth. So right away you can see, well, if apologetics can cover that many fields, then who can ever possibly hope to master, the discipline of apologetics or the field of apologetics? And the answer is no one, right? The wonderful thing, though, is that wherever God gives you maybe a passion and an interest, whether it's theology or philosophy or sometimes it's science, that you can use that and bring intelligent conversations regarding your faith into whatever field you may be studying or working in even. I have the privilege a number of times a year to speak on university campuses. I partner with Power to Change in the Waterloo area. And what's often encouraging is connected to local chapters of Power to Change at the universities, Christian professors tend to connect with them and sometimes come and speak to them from their own field. I mean, from fields like physics or biology or some of the hard sciences, or sometimes philosophy, which I think is terribly encouraging for our young people today to see how our faith can intersect with any field of understanding. Not just it's not just something we confine to spiritual conversations or churchy conversations. Well, is apologetics biblical? You probably read through, someone made a comment this morning, we were just chatting about the book. I hope you all enjoyed diving into When Skeptics Ask. I chose this book, it's because it's a fairly good, broad stroke introduction to many of the kinds of arguments from apologetics that you can chase down or become familiar with. I realize it's probably a challenging read. My hope is that you walk away with something, and that something would have tweaked your interest. I imagine some chapters you went, oh, this is interesting, and some you went, I have no idea what they're talking about. And if that's the case, then you're pretty normal. But the comment was, is this how the biblical thinkers really thought? Well, in many respects, no. Some of the fields of study and the things that we understand today were not part of their worldview at the time. But apologetics is biblical in terms of the discipline or the exercise of being prepared to give a defense for our faith. And just to kind of give us a bit of a summary, Paul was probably one of the first working apologists in this sense, starting with how he spread the gospel throughout his missionary travels. And Luke gives us insight to this in Acts 17, that Paul had a pattern to how he did his missionary journeys. He would go from city to city, and the first thing he would do, if there was one in the city, is he would locate the local synagogue. and he would go into the synagogues first to reason with the Jews. And with the Jews, because he could reason from this standpoint, he would begin with the Old Testament. And from the Old Testament, he would reason with them that Jesus was the Christ, that he was the Messiah. And from the Old Testament, he would reason with them that the Messiah, in fact, did have to die, as Jesus did, and rose from the grave. But Paul also could draw, and did draw, connections from the pagan worldview of the Greeks, who he was also witnessing to point them to God's truth revealed in Christ. And here we see one of the best examples we see, maybe the clearest we see, is in Acts 17, and Paul's address to the Athenians. And here Paul, his approach is much different than that of the Jews because he has no shared worldview. But as an educated man, Paul understands at least how the Greeks think. And so he looks for connection points to which he can bring biblical truth, because all truth is God's truth. So he looks for points of connection with their worldview, that there were some things they understood about divinity or the divine that weren't wrong, but they were just incomplete. And so Paul connected the dots for them, introducing them to the God who created, the God who is other, and the God who revealed himself in Jesus. So this was Paul's ministry. And then when we look at Paul's writing ministry, many of his epistles, were aimed at defending the Christian belief against error and heresy. Luke, likewise, he writes to Theophilus an orderly account based on his thorough historical research. Really, most likely he went around and spoke to eyewitnesses or people who had been party to eyewitnesses in order to compile his orderly account that he's then wrote for Theophilus and Theophilus' community so that they might know with certainty the things that they've been taught. John also clearly tells his readers in 1 John that he's writing to refute those who are trying to lead you astray. Right off the get-go, the early church was confronted by teaching that opposed the Christian gospel or distorted it. And so the apostles, in many respects, were seeking to present or provide a defense for the church, that Christians could defend against those who maybe denied that Jesus had come in the flesh. And we see in John's first letter probably a creeping in as an early form or the early seeds of Gnosticism, which was a Greek mystical religious sect. So, although not formal apologetic works, most of the New Testament Acts and Pauline writings serve to defend the truth of Jesus' ministry and resurrection, and or offer a polemical defense for Christianity against false teaching that sought to pervert the truth of Christ. So right from the start, apologetics, and this is something in my own ministry that came out of my, kind of the sense of call that God laid in my life, was I had been studying Christian apologetics. I did a master's degree from Biola University in apologetics, and I was doing that while I was pastoring. And while I was studying, I just was realizing more and more how necessary this is, not for experts, not for university debates, not for the celebrity apologist who is known around the world or anything like that, but for the normal Christian sitting in the pew, that this ought to be part of our discipleship toolbox for training, for discipling, and raising up the next generation. And that was, it's just evident from the very start that this was part of the Christian discipleship toolbox. Okay, just a bit of a summary then. So it started with the apostles and the Gospels. But now looking at it in history, we see really this development of the discipline of apologetics throughout history. And what's interesting, and again, I think this ought to encourage us to see as, in particular, Western history develops. Of course, the mindset of Western history is being shaped as well by many different influences and forces over time. And we see through time how God raised up particular individuals who are noteworthy. I'm sure there were many more. but who looked at, I guess, the worldview or mindset landscape of the world around them and sought to bring a biblical defense of the gospel into their day and age. And I think that's important to understand so that we don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. Because, when I began my ministry just a dozen years ago, many of the concerns, the apologetic kind of concerns that were chief on people's minds, today isn't so much the case. I mean, there's still those kinds of arguments, but our culture has shifted, and the generational mindset has shifted very quickly. And so Pastor Chris mentioned that, I sensed this calling to, I guess you could specialize, but for a while I really focused on this whole area around gender and sexuality. And I didn't do that that was not something I ever set out to do when I began ministry. It just emerged out of necessity as the culture changed, and the pressures and the kinds of challenges to faith that the church was facing shifted. And so I just kind of pivoted along with it in order to try and serve as best I could. But we see this kind of movement throughout history. We looked at apologetics beginning in the New Testament era, and I'm just going to give you a quick overview and then highlight a couple of these. It then moved into the patristic era, which was the church. The age of the church fathers really was the next generation or two or three that followed the apostles. Roughly from about 100 to 600 is considered broadly the patristic era. In that era, one notable person to be aware of is Augustine. He was one of the chief bishops in the Church of Rome, but a brilliant thinker with a tremendous testimony of faith, of how he came to faith out of really a pagan life. St. Anselm is another noteworthy figure. We're now moving towards more of the Middle Ages. St. Thomas Aquinas is another very notable figure. We'll just touch on him briefly. And then between the 1600s and 1800s, there's this in terms of Western history, there's this period known as the Enlightenment. Sometimes it's referred to as the Age of Reason, when man's philosophy and kind of a humanistic worldview began to creep into the Western mindset and started shaping how people viewed the world and understood themselves in the light of it. Then moving into the modern era, sometime between the 18 and 1900s, maybe into the middle of the 1900s. We could go as late as that. And then the postmodern era, beginning sometime in the 1960s, maybe to the present, depends on who you talk to. Arguably, some people would suggest that we are postmodern. We're through the postmodern era. I'm just going to move through these fairly quickly. One thing I'll do, Chris, maybe also is, because I'm moving quickly, and if you can't write fast enough, I'm happy to send a PDF copy of my slides that you can distribute to the group, right? So if you feel like, I missed that, okay, you'll get it. It'll come back around. Everybody's saying, okay. I realize this. If you could fault me on a number of things. One of them would be I usually have more content than I need, but rather have too much than not enough. Just some notable voices, though, in the patristic era. Figures like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, these are all church fathers, that notable defenders of the faith in their time, but really writing some of the earliest formal apologetic works for the Christian faith. And of course, for the most part, they're writing to defend Christianity in the face of Roman paganism. Many of their defenses surrounded why Christians make the best citizens. And they were arguing from the standpoint of Christian ethics and the Christian, the Christian belief system, which included God's sovereignty over installing secular leaders, and the Christian's responsibility to be, loyal servants to whoever's the governing power of the day, within parameters, of course. But so presenting, and in some cases, some of these writers were responding to or beginning to refute again early heresies that were creeping into Christian faith. As the Christian faith spread, and of course, Christian thinkers are trying to, I guess, formalize or normalize Christian doctrines. They're also bumping up into people, who are becoming Christians, but bringing in mindsets or ideas from their pagan worldview. And so there were often cases where they would have to defend against or, I suppose, keep some pagan ideas from slipping into Christian doctrine. And so they would write defenses towards that. I'll just make a couple notes. Augustine is worth mentioning as one figure. He wrote hundreds of works, including apologetic works against, among other things, the heresy of Arianism. Arianism was an early Christian heresy, really debating or, denying the eternal nature of the Son, that Jesus was divine, but he was some kind of subordinate divinity. This was actually the chief concern of the Council of Nicaea, called by Emperor Constantine in 325. He responded to Donatism, which debated the nature of the church and rejected baptism. Manichaeism was a variant form of Gnosticism, which again brought kind of an Eastern mystic mindset into Christianity. And then Pelagianism, which denies total depravity and views Jesus' passion not as an atonement for sin, but as setting a good example. So these were the kinds of defenses that early Christian patristic writers were needing to defend, these core Christian doctrines that we maybe take for granted. And also probably rooted in Augustine's apologetic approach was, and maybe what he's best known for, is that Augustine saw faith and reason as working together. Often in our culture, sometimes faith is viewed as something that stands in opposition to reason. There's an old quote from Mark Twain. He said, faith is believe in what you know ain't so, is how Mark Twain put it. Augustine understood, though, but from Scripture, our faith is a reasoned faith. God would come to Israel and say, come, let's reason together. Let's look at the facts and reason forward from there. So Augustine very much wanted to help Christians see that faith and reason went together to bring a person to faith in Jesus. And he says in one of his sermons, for faith is understanding step and understanding faith's attainment. St. Anselm was, in the 11th century, was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He is most known for forming the ontological argument for God's existence, which is a big word, and it's an even more confusing argument. I don't think I'm going to spend a whole lot of time to try and unpack it. But his argument basically went something like this, that by definition, God is a being than which, and this is the language he uses, a being than which none greater can be imagined. So God is the greatest possible being that we could ever imagine. And he says a being that necessarily exists in reality is greater than a being that does not necessarily exist. So if God is the greatest possible being we can conceive of, and we have to realize something, that a being, the greatest possible being we can conceive of that necessarily exists or must exist, is greater than a being, greater possible being that we could conceive of that doesn't necessarily exist. And so God must necessarily exist if he is the greatest possible being, is the crux of his argument. He says by definition, if God exists as an idea in the mind but not necessarily exists in reality, that means there could be something that greater that we could imagine than that God. He says, but we can't imagine something greater than God. He's the greatest possible being we can imagine. Thus, if God exists in the mind as an idea, as the greatest possible being, then he must necessarily exist. God exists in the mind as an idea, therefore God necessarily exists in reality. That's a sketch of his argument. It's pretty heady, but there was also some genius to it. And it's still used in some circles, and some seek to develop on it. I'll confess to you, it's not one that I readily gravitate toward. I have a difficult time just grasping it. But for your consideration, maybe you click with it and you can go with it and do something with it. That'd be great. St. Thomas Aquinas was another great Christian thinker. He was a 13th century. In the 13th century, he was a Catholic monk, and he was really part of this movement in the 13th century of the reemergence of Aristotelian philosophy. It's hard to realize because of where we are in the modern world. We've sent a person to the moon, men to the moon. We've got the Hubble telescope and beyond that shows us we have a much greater understanding of the cosmos. So we can't appreciate a time in history where people didn't have that body of knowledge. They could go outside and look at the stars and kind of get a sense for the world. There wasn't just readily available comprehensive scholastic systems of understanding of the universe. Well, Aristotle was probably one of the earliest ones to try and put together an understanding of the universe. And sometime in the early Middle Ages, the church rediscovered Aristotelian philosophy as a comprehensive system of understanding the world. And they thought, well, maybe there's something useful here that we can use. And it began to emerge as this body of knowledge. Of course, you could understand the danger in that, though. As a Greek philosophy, there are certain pagan assumptions built into that universal understanding. So Augustine sought to demonstrate the coherence of Christianity and Aristotelian philosophy, desiring to show the relationship between faith and reason, and therefore sought to Christianize the philosophy of Aristotle and correct his assumptions where God's revelation so corrected. So again, because all truth is God's truth, it's not as though the Greek philosophers didn't have anything right. They very much directed, their reasoned thought to the world. And of course, we know from Scripture that God does reveal himself to a degree through creation, right? That we can look at creation, and Paul says in Romans 1, at least, from the creation, we can at least determine that there is a God who exists, who is eternal in nature, and must be, infinitely powerful. And so it's not as though mankind outside of Christianity can't see some of these truths. The Greeks certainly did, and they wrote that into their philosophy, but of course packed in there, they did not have the special revelation of God. They did not have the revelation of God in his person that he revealed himself through, first of all, through the patriarchs and the Old Testament and Moses, but then ultimately through the person of Jesus. So Aquinas simply sought to take the good out of Aristotelian philosophy and then reshape it, I suppose, or correct it according to God's revelation. He's most famous for his 5 ways argument to demonstrate God's existence. And this is something you could chase down. It is still, at least a derivative of it, still used widely in many apologetic circles. The first one was motion, and this came right from Aristotle as well, but the idea that there's an unmoved mover. Let's see if I break this down any further. No. So this is the idea that, we live in a world where things are in motion. This moves to here, this moves to there. Everything's always in motion. Well, if you rewind the tape back to the very beginning, something must have been the first push to get things in motion. And whatever that thing was couldn't have been set in motion by something else because it would be the first. And he derived from that therefore there must be a God who is the one responsible for setting all things into motion. He made the same similar arguments from things like cause. The idea that no efficient cause can be the cause of itself, or it would have to pre-exist itself. Therefore, there must be an ultimate cause behind all causes, right? We live in a world of cause and effect. Cause and effect, all the way back in time. To some point, You can't have cause and effect for infinity, so at some point there had to be an original cause. And he again argues this points towards God. As with the necessity of being, he posited, you know what, when we think about everything in the world, nothing in the world that we can think about has to exist necessarily. Everything I can imagine in this world or think about in this world, it's possible to think about that thing not existing. And yet everything exists, which means that everything that could possibly not exist can't be the cause of its own existence. Something outside must be the cause. And again, this points to the existence of a necessary being, a being that we cannot imagine not existing, and that would be God. Graduation is, again, another part of this 5 ways. Graduation is the idea that there are variations. So someone might stand next to me and be taller, and you'd say, so you're shorter and he's taller, right? So there's a graduation of height. Or it's colder today than it was yesterday is a graduation of temperature. So there's graduations in every sphere we can think about, from less to more, but in order for there to be graduations less to more, there has to be an ultimate standard we measure those things against. And that, again, that ultimate standard points towards a perfect being. And then the idea of order, which I'd like to touch on in one of our arguments, but the idea that, why is the world an orderly world? Why do my immaterial thoughts line up with material things in the world? In fact, I can think about this water bottle that's in my hand right here. It's a material thing, it exists, and somehow my thoughts can connect with it. But even more surprisingly is on my way home tonight, I can think about this water bottle. It's no longer physically in my presence. It'll probably be in the recycling bin. But my thoughts are actually about the bottle. Why do we have a rationally ordered existence? And Aquinas saw this as pointing towards the existence of a rational creator. Okay, move a little quicker here. Looking at the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a cultural movement based upon growing confidence in the power of human reason. This is where humanity really became very optimistic about what we could attain by the power of our reasoning minds. Its purpose was to reform society using reason rather than tradition, particularly faith tradition or Christian tradition, because the context was primarily Europe, which was Christian in its foundations. Rather than using faith and revelation, it sought to use reason to be the determiner of truth and advance knowledge ultimately through science. As academics became more and more reliant on reason, skeptical questions concerning established Christian beliefs began to emerge. Blaise Pascal was probably a notable Christian thinker in this time period. He wrote a number of works, but one of them was a critique of reason's ability to disprove God and the Christian's inability to prove it. In other words, Pascal wanted to demonstrate that, look, yes, reason is crucial and reason is vital, but we need to be a little bit more humble about what we can hope to accomplish through reason. We can't by reason actually disprove that there's a God, nor can we rely on reason as the means of proving there's a God. We have to look to something else. And of course, that something else is God himself and his revelation. It's not that these are contrary to reason, but we have to keep reason in its appropriate sphere. This raised the discussion, sometimes referred to as the magisterial versus ministerial role of reason. The age of enlightenment sought to elevate reason to a magisterial role. That is, that reason would determine everything, that reason controlled everything. Rather, the Christian view is that reason has a ministerial role, that reason serves faith. It serves to strengthen faith. It serves to build faith, but we can't create faith through reason. So Pascal's point was that both reason's critique the idea that reason could be used to disprove God, and the Christian, any Christian notion that it would have the ability to prove God. He said, in the end, both positions would be wagering, that they were right, that we can disprove God by reason or prove him by reason. He says, in the end, those are a wager. And so he actually developed this apologetic known as Pascal's wager, where he demonstrates through a series of movements and choices to see that only the Christian wager in the end is the winning one. Into the modern era, as man's knowledge of the world grew through science, apologetics more and more developed scientific arguments for Christianity, seeking to produce a body of evidence that could be presented for support. And maybe one of the best known, responses or illustrations of this mindset was through William Paley. He wrote a book called A View of the Evidences of Christianity and Natural Theology, and he's most famous for his watchmaker argument. If you've ever heard of this, the argument was basically formulated, if I walk along the road and I see a stone sitting there, and I think, then I say to my friend, that stone's been sitting there for, forever. They wouldn't bat an eyelash. They wouldn't think, oh, yeah, you're probably right, whatever. But if we were walking along a path and I saw a pocket watch, and I said, oh, that pocket watch, it's just been there forever. It's always been there. They would stop and say, wait a second, right? And they would look at the fact that the pocket watch has design and motion, and it's clearly the result of an intelligent designer, right? And Paley kind of argues then the fact of its contrivances and its workings points to the idea that there's intelligence behind it. We wouldn't just assume it just popped into existence or it's just always been there. Somebody is responsible for it. And from there he argues, now let's think about this a little more clearly when we think about the intricacies of the created world and humanity and living creatures and things like that, far more complicated, sophisticated than a simple pocket watch. And yet what would make us think that, of course we're getting into where people are starting to think towards more materialistic reasons for the creation of the world or the diversity of species, etc. Darwin's probably still about 60, 70 years away, but the theory of evolution was beginning to be shared among natural theologians at the time. Into the postmodern era, which is where we find ourselves more recently. Today, many apologetic thinkers draw from the varying schools that emerged from the Enlightenment and into the modern age, but some still go back to Aquinas and some of those earlier arguments, as well as Anselm and his ontological argument. There are so many different approaches which are taken that they've actually been broken into broad categories. I mean, again, apologetics is a field that's just so broad, and I kind of covered the many different academic disciplines that it could include. But even within that, broadly speaking, there are some different, I suppose, approaches or philosophies of apologetics and how to do them. Some broad schools. I'll just mention a number of the most notable or more widely used. Evidential apologetics is a fairly broad term, and it actually includes more than just one approach. It includes a classical apologetics, what's referred to as classical apologetics, which I'll talk about in a second. Historical apologetics. More recently, there's there's an approach referred to as a cumulative case. There's another field known as presuppositional apologetics, and then worth noting is the whole field of Reformed epistemology, which is a little bit of a different duck in itself, but it's worth mentioning. Evidential apologetics, as the name would suggest, draws heavily on rational arguments and evidence for God's existence. It takes seriously some of the real intellectual roadblocks to belief, and I think that is something we need to take seriously, that that there are some roadblocks that people have. They're intellectual. Not all faith roadblocks are intellectual. Not all faith doubts are. Some are emotional. Of course, ultimately, there's a spiritual component to our inability to recognize the truth about God. But some of those roadblocks are intellectual and really do need to be addressed and taken seriously. And again, it holds in balance this magisterial, the idea that reason stands over the gospel, versus ministerial, that reason actually is in service of the gospel. It holds in balance that role of reason in apologetics. Taking into account what Paul said in Ephesians 4, he says, "So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking." And this, the same language can go back to Paul in Romans 1, where he talks about because they exchanged the glory of God and worshiped and served the creation rather than the Creator, God handed them over to the futility of their minds. In other words, their thinking became futile because the proper starting point for all true knowledge, which is God, they rejected, which meant that all their thinking, it doesn't mean that everything they think is false, but it all starts from a false starting point, a false premise. And so their thinking is futile, and their hearts are darkened because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. And elsewhere in 1 Corinthians 2, he says, "The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit." And I think broadly, evidential apologetics rightly takes into account that we cannot argue anyone into the kingdom. Right? We can't ever manufacture faith. Sometimes I think people think Christian apologetics are just, it's kind of like Christian ninjutsu. If you just learn, the right arguments, that you can corner someone into believing, and it just can't be done, right? But we can give a good defense and help to break down some of those faith barriers that may be real ones that need to be dealt with, because we don't want people to just, ignore their doubts, but to come to Christ realizing that if He is the truth, then I should be able to wrestle through my doubts as a Christian. And I think that's something we need to bear in mind. Okay, so within evidential apologetics, there are a number of approaches. I'm going to touch on one. I have three in your notes, and this is where we're getting to your note package one. I thought, I'll point out, I think, what are three of the most familiar, or some of the most familiar, and then give you some examples. Actually, we're going to look at two. We're going to look at classical apologetics and evidential or historical apologetics. And that's going to comprise the content then of some of the examples we're going to look at. It doesn't give you a sampling of all of the methods. There's just no way we could do that in a Saturday morning or even a month of Saturdays, I don't think. But I do want to talk about classical apologetics. It's so called because they draw upon long-standing arguments like the arguments that Anselm made and Aquinas made. Some of those were more philosophical in nature, but they're long-standing arguments, and they still have use, and they still stand to debate. The classical method, broadly speaking, it employs a two-step method, or a two-step approach. It sees that the first approach to moving someone toward faith is to deal with the existence of God in general. And you can appreciate some of the wisdom in that. So the kinds of arguments that the classical apologists would say we need to begin with are arguments that point to God's existence, or theism in general, or the general idea that there is a God. Right? And then the second step would be, once you've established with the person who you're speaking to the general principle or the general truth that, yes, there is a God who exists, then you move towards some second form of arguments, more evidential or historical arguments, to argue for Well, yes, there is a God, so we've established that. Now I want to show you why the Christian God has to be that God, or why the Christian God is true. So it's kind of a two-step approach. Some notable figures in this field would be apologists like William Lane Craig, who's just a brilliant thinker. Sometimes he's hard to follow. He's pretty smart. Norm Geisler, who is the author, editor of the book that you have, When Skeptics Ask, the late Norm Geisler, he's passed now, but did a tremendous amount of work, served the church, taught apologetics at Southern Evangelical Seminary, I believe, for most of his career, a great apologetic scholar. Another late scholar who I really like was R.C. Sproul. R.C. Sproul was big on Aquinas. He really liked St. Thomas Aquinas, but also was a proponent of a classical apologetic approach. And I like Sproul too, because I found Sproul a little bit more relatable. He spoke. I find he speaks. Well, he's dead now, but his videos are still out there in a little more, street level English. And of course, his ministry, Ligoniers, the purpose of Ligoniers, he stated, was he wanted to bridge the gap between the pew and the seminary. And that was kind of where he aimed, and I think he served the church well in that. Some examples of classical arguments, and here's where I want to get to some examples. The cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument, which would all be classical arguments, and each of them would represent classical arguments, generally speaking, that would look after the first step of a classical approach, that is arguing for God's existence from three different angles. Now I see we're about time for a break. Yep. So maybe what we'll do is hit the pause. We'll come back, and I'll have time to cover one. The rest will be on the slides, I guess. Yeah, come back. Don't go away. Don't drive away. I'll touch on one. I'll have to leave the other two, because I also want to make sure I get to the next step, which is an historical argument for God's or for the gospel. And specifically, we're going to look at the defense of the resurrection, a historical defense of the resurrection, which leads you to your assignment and also the practicum. So we've got some ground to cover, but don't worry, we'll get through. So we'll pause there, and we just... you were clapping because we're pausing. Oh, yeah, yes. All right, so we're back at what time there, Chris? 5 after 10. Okay. Okay, as people are coming back in, I will. I'll just mention something else. If you, oh. This makes me feel like Iron Man.
Yes, I've heard that before.
I thought I was the first one to say it. No, something I'll just mention. Twice a year, we put out Prepare to Answer puts out a newsletter. Usually, just to tell a bit about our ministry, what's going on. I always, in the back, I like to recommend good resources. So I'll usually recommend books that I've read relating to faith and culture, good apologetic works, as well as responding to culture. This past newsletter, I recommended a book on deconstruction, faith deconstruction, a guide to discussing assisted suicide, which is pretty relevant to our context in Canada right now, and then one other work, Delighting in the Trinity. We have a YouTube channel, and I have a number of videos on the Trinity. I cannot believe the amount of opposition that I face online to the doctrine of the Trinity. It's incredible. Such a critical doctrine, though, for our faith and understanding the gospel and the God we worship. There are some channels that are devoted to debunking the Trinity, but I would say most of them are in some kind of Christian sect. Yeah, it's some Muslims, but very few Muslims. Most are part of some kind of Christian sect. Yep. Or former Christians who just like to bash for whatever reason. Also, just a quick note on, it's not on the little card I gave you, but we did just release a video series, a 4-part video series called So Much More Than Sex. It's something I delivered last year to a group of young adults, and we videoed it and then produced it. Really, it develops, it's not so much a repetition of, here are the boundary lines for biblical sexual ethic. It really develops a biblical theology of sex. So helping to understand what our sexually ordered bodies are and are for, and the eternal significance of them. So anyway, something for you to maybe check out. And then we'll write an article of some kind, and this article was talking about the role of theology in apologetics. And more I'm seeing the need that often we can give a good defense just by giving a clear presentation of the Christian faith, sound theology. I don't want to take a lot of time, but just a few weeks ago, a young person at our church approached me in tears because she'd been kind of cornered by her friends at school and kind of ganged up on, and they kind of railed on her about her beliefs. And I said, "Oh my goodness!" I said, "What kind of questions?" And she said, "You know what? I can't talk about it, but can I text them to you or email them to you?" I said, "Sure." And I was expecting to get she was getting beaten up about probably LGBT or something like that, or possibly creation evolution or something along those lines. And it was, how could God create a world and allow evil? Why does God get to be the judge? Why is God's justice the way, right? Why would God allow like a murderer who could just accept Jesus and go to heaven, but a perfectly good person, right, who didn't ever do anything wrong, goes to hell? How is that fair? There were about 4 questions, and I read them all, and I realized these are all theological questions. And my young friend didn't have, she wasn't able to respond. Anyway, digress. If you'd like a copy, feel free. If you'd like to receive it, there's a sign-up sheet there for our mailing list. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is I want to make sure that we have time to move through the example of an historical apologetic, which is the defense of the resurrection, because that will directly relate to, you don't have that in your notes yet, that's note pack 2. That'll directly relate to the practicum and then also to your assignments. So what I think I'm going to do for our classical apologetics is just introduce you to the broad strokes of the arguments, and then maybe I'll touch on some of the key points so at least you're familiar with them. Here's a great example of one argument would be considered like the cosmological argument. The Kalam cosmological argument is a particular cosmological argument that's been most widely developed by William Lane Craig. So it's an argument from reason that basically follows a logical syllogism, so a logical progression of ideas or logical premises that lead to a logical conclusion. So here's how the Kalam cosmological arguments state it. The first premise states that, one, whatever begins to exist has a cause, must have a cause. The second premise is that the universe had a beginning. The universe began. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. So those are the broad strokes of the argument. Whatever exists, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. And of course, then the logic of the argument is, so then we need to then direct someone, if we can establish, right, this is logically correct, if we agree with the argument, then we use the argument, then, okay, now let's talk about who or what is this cause. And that's the kind of the next step of the classical approach. The first premise is fairly intuitive. It's difficult to argue with, and it's rooted in the assumption that something can't come from nothing, right? Why is there anything? Things don't just pop into existence. To suggest that something could come from nothing would be, well, someone could say, oh yeah, something could come from nothing. You just have to ask, okay, could you give me an example? Right? Nothing comes from nothing. Something has to come from something. If things really could come into being without being caused, just popping into existence, why doesn't that happen all the time? Right? One objection to this first premise, often as a common objection, is, okay, well, if God caused the universe, I see where you're going. If God caused the universe, then what caused God? And that objection just needs to be responded to with a clarification of premise one. Premise one doesn't say that everything that exists has a cause. It says everything that begins to exist has a cause. So everything that has a starting point, or a beginning, needs to be caused by something. So that's fairly straightforward. The second premise is sometimes a little more difficult, although maybe not so much these days, but it can be argued, or is still a premise that some people will want to argue with, who may want to avoid the conclusion. Right? In response to the idea that the universe had a beginning, the existence of the universe seems pretty obvious, so we shouldn't have to argue for the universe's existence. If someone wants to argue against it, I think the burden of proof is on them. But it did have a beginning. And to establish that, William Lane Craig, who's kind of, again, he's the chief developer, he's not the only one, but generally speaking, in response to defending the idea or defending the truth that the universe has a beginning, moved towards two kinds of argumentation. One is philosophical, and the other is scientific. So there are two kinds of arguments. On the philosophical side, we'll just touch on that for a moment. Philosophical objection sometimes deals with, or William Lane Craig immediately goes to discussing the possibility of actual infinities. So the idea that the universe would be eternal would mean that the universe existed for infinite time. Now, most cosmological, or most people today would agree that our universe had a beginning. The way that many are trying to get around that is to posit a multiverse, the idea that ours is one of an infinite number of possible universes. That's one. A friend of mine, Kirk Durston, who's an apologist up in the Elmira area, he addresses the multiverse idea. It's a little bit beyond me, I'll be honest. The only problem with the multiverse is there's no proof for it in terms of the person who wants to defend it. But even on the conceptual side, there's reasons to deny it. But on the philosophical side of arguing for the universe's having a beginning, is the idea of, it's a philosophical idea about thinking about infinities or infinites. The notion that we think, we have an idea, or we use infinities in mathematics, I suppose. But the idea that something infinite could actually exist leads to all kinds of problems in the material world. And here's an example that William Lane Craig uses, and I think this is in your notes, so you don't have to worry about writing it down. He uses golf balls, but imagine that there's an infinite set of, I'm using tennis balls, or those are baseballs or basketballs, I don't know. But an infinite set of balls where every odd numbered ball is white, but every even numbered ball is red. And that set goes on for eternity, or for infinity, right? Well, if it was an actual set, we start to run into some absurd situations. For instance, if that were the case, you could subtract all of the red balls from that infinite set of balls. So you're basically taking away half of the infinite set. But because it's infinite, the result you'd be left with is that you would have two infinite sets. Or rather, you would have the case where you would have an infinite set that's equal to half of an infinite set. It's just, it starts to lead to, and if you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Exactly, right? It's an absurdity. It can't exist in material time and space because it just can't. It leads to some absurd situations. Similarly, and William Craig notes this as another example of the impossibility of actual infinites. Think about infinity in terms of time. And if we considered, let's say that the present moment is 0, right? 0 units of time, or whatever you want to say. Let's just say years. So if the present moment is 0, it means that 1 year ago would be -1, and 1 year from now would be 1, and so forth. So counting forward from 0, the reality of infinity is, how long would it take you to count to infinity starting at 0? You could never do it. It'd take you forever, right? Because as soon as you get to the end, just add one more and you keep on going, right? That's infinity. And so from that standpoint, if you think about time, right, it means that starting from the present and counting forward, to count to infinity would take an eternity. We could never get there. We could never count far enough to get to the end point. But it also works if you move backwards in time. So, in other words, how far back would you have to go to get to the beginning of infinite time in the past? You could never get there. And the result being that, again, this is where actual infinites result in absurdities, is that if time is infinite in the past, then there's no way to get to the present moment, because you could never get back. As soon as you go back, okay, I started where? There. No, actually, keep going back. Right? You could never start in order to get to the. And the way William Lane Craig describes it is, it's kind of like, it would be like trying to jump out of an infinitely deep hole, right? You would never, there's no point from which you could start your jump, because it would just keep going down, 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 down. You see, so conceptually we understand infinities. We can deal with them abstractly, but when we start talking about bringing them into reality, we end up with absurdities. And so there's part of the philosophical argumentation. On philosophical grounds, the universe as a spatio-temporal world, in other words, we live in a time-bound universe, right? Time is one of the boundaries of our universe. It couldn't be eternal. It has to have had a beginning. Because, again, if it was eternal, we would never have arrived at the present moment, because time is infinite in both directions. So that's a philosophical response, a couple of arguments from philosophy against those who would try and posit, ultimately the universe is eternal. It's never had a beginning. Therefore, it's never needed a cause. Okay, so that's one argument from philosophy against the notion of an eternal universe. The other arguments come from science. There are a number of scientific arguments, mostly from the fields of cosmology, astronomy, physics. Just a couple notable examples. I don't have time to go into them all, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not a scientist. I'm a pastor and theologian, so science, I love to read this stuff, but I won't stand up here to purport to be an expert on it. Here's some people who are, or were. One argument against an infinite universe actually comes from the field of astronomy and physics. In 1916, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, when Einstein posited his theory of relativity, his theory predicted that we live in an expanding universe, that the universe is continually expanding outward. But Einstein fudged his numbers in order to bring his relativity theory into line with the common wisdom of the day, which was that the universe was eternal, right? That we lived in as naturalism and materialism took over kind of the scientific thinking of our day, materialism posited that all that exists is time plus matter plus chance, right? We don't think of any transcendent cause outside. Therefore, if the universe is all there is, then the universe has to explain itself, and therefore the universe must be eternal. Einstein came up with his theory that seemed to bump against that theory, so he actually fudged his numbers to make it fit that. He later would go on to admit that was the biggest mistake of his life, because in around 1929, Edwin Hubble, the namesake of the Hubble telescope, right? He was an astronomer, and he discovered in his own research that, in fact, the galaxies were expanding outward from a center point. And what he ultimately observed, which I can only explain in the most rudimentary way, what he ultimately observed was that the further away galaxies were from us, it appeared that they were accelerating away from us faster than the closer galaxies. And the way he determined that was the redshift, yes, which is the frequency of light waves. The further away they got, the redder the light they were emitting became, which again, I believe that, which means those light waves are moving faster than the other ones down the spectrum. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. Anyway, what his observation demonstrated, though, was that, in fact, and the math behind that is, think about the universe as like you're baking a raisin loaf, right? That's round, and it starts to expand, right? And the raisins in the center, right? You got two raisins that maybe in the very little, and as the loaf expands, they move apart this far. But the raisins that were on the outside of the loaf, that moved to the edge, they moved out this far in the same amount of time, right? So they had to travel faster because they were further away from the center. So that's the raisin loaf. There you go. So that was what Hubble's observations from astronomy demonstrated, that from the physical evidence that we see, the universe seems to be expanding outward from a center point. Later in 1970, eventually Einstein went to the observatory to see Hubble's observation, and when he did, he conceded. He said, "Yeah, I was wrong." I think he was probably relieved to know that his relativity theory still had merit. He didn't have to fudge his numbers, but he realized he'd made a terrible mistake. In 1970, Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose published research which confirmed Einstein's initial prediction and demonstrated that this was inescapable, that the universe had a beginning point at some finite time in past. And they posited, mathematically, that point in the past would have to therefore be a singularity, which they refer to as a singularity, which would have a region of 0 area and 0 volume. 0 area and 0 volume is a fancy way of saying nothing. Right. The theorem, as Hawking stated later in 1996, he says, led to the abandonment of attempts to argue that there was a previous contracting phase and a non-singular bounce into expansion. In other words, there were some who tried to deal with the expansion by positing basically a yo-yo model of the universe. It was just doing a continual, it would just do the same, out and back and out, and that's what was going on for eternity. And what Hawkins and Penrose, what their work just demonstrated that was that oscillating theory couldn't exist. In 1996, he said that we had to abandon that model. Instead, almost everyone now, he says, believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at what he calls the Big Bang. And in 1992, interestingly, there was an amazing discovery referred to as COBE, Cosmic Background Explorer, was pictures of the cosmos that were taken using basically infrared kind of imaging. The theory being, okay, so let's posit that the universe began from an initial starting point and exploded into existence. If that actually happened, and incidentally, I'm not here to tell you that it did. I'm just telling you what the science seems to be pointing towards. All right. But they posited that if that happened, what we would expect to see then is some background radiation, similar to if you were to turn up your oven to 600 degrees, right? Put an infrared camera in your kitchen, and focus it on the kitchen, and your oven's at 600 degrees, and then you open the door of the oven. What the camera's going to show is the dissipation of heat into the room, right? And then eventually it would cool down. That's the sort of effect they expected to find if in fact the universe began from an infinitely hot starting point and expanded outward. And in 1992, that's exactly what they found when they started taking pictures, infrared pictures of the cosmos. They did in fact find this background radiation that they expected to be there. So those are some scientific arguments pointing towards the fact that, that all of our observations seem to confirm the idea that the universe had a starting point and isn't eternal. Along those same lines, the second law of thermodynamics, you know what? I'll leave that to your reading. You can read that in your notes. Second law of thermodynamics. All right. So, premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe has a cause. But how do we get from this cause to the God of the Bible? And of course, we can get part of the way there, and some of the argument that William Lane Craig uses goes something like this. How do we get from cause to God? And he would say, whatever caused a space-time universe, which is what we live in, can't exist within space and time. Because if whatever the cause is bringing a space-time universe into being, then it can't be in space-time itself. Otherwise, it's part of the universe. It has to be outside of space-time. And whatever this cause is outside of space and time that caused everything else also cannot be a scientific cause. There are two types of causes. Let's say I walked over to the edge of the room and I flicked off the lights. And I said, okay, why did the lights go out? What answer would you give? Okay, one answer would be you turned them out. What other answer would we give? Why did the lights go out? Right, because electricity goes through those cords, right? And they go to and there's filaments and as soon as electricity, you would give a scientific explanation. There are two kinds of explanations. Scientific, right? Electricity stopped going and personal. You turned off the lights. So that's personal agency. Well, whatever caused the space-time universe to come into existence can't exist within space-time. So scientific explanations that are scientific explanations are explanations that involve space-time, physical causes, cause-effect, can't be the cause of the universe. The only alternative is personal agency. So there is how Craig would argue towards, again, he wouldn't get to Jesus from there. He would get to whatever caused the universe must be a spaceless, timeless, eternal, personal agent. All right. When you start to describe that, you're starting to describe the God who as he's revealed himself in Scripture, right? Okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to skip over the teleological argument, but it's in your notes, and the moral argument. I'll just state the teleological argument. Telos comes from the Greek word simply meaning purpose or goal or end. Paley's watchmaker argument is a teleological, an argument from design. Look how things are designed, and the arguments from design, that field is just exploding, especially in the area of microbiology, which is so interesting. I'm not a microbiologist, but I find that stuff so interesting, how microbiologists are finding machines in living cells that make watches look like child's play. It's fascinating. To say nothing of the fact that in order for cells to even exist and reproduce, they first have to have the information coded in them. Information is not physical. Information is immaterial. Yes, it's chemically coded, but the coding itself isn't a physical thing. Anyway, they're great examples from apologetics from design. I think I might have given you some examples in your notes. If not, I'll certainly be able to give you some. Oh, I have. They're in the slides. They'll be there. Examples from physics and from microbiology of arguments from design. Okay, I won't have time to get into them. Fine-tuning. The last classical example is the moral argument, and I just have time to state it, which is, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral and values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And by objective we mean, so an objective fact, the CN Tower is in Toronto. That's an objective fact. That's true whether I believe it or not. That's true whether you agree with me or not, right? Because it exists outside of me, right? It's true for all people in all places in all time, right? Even for the person in Australia, the CN Tower is in Toronto. Right? That's an objective truth. A subjective truth is more along the lines of, it's cold outside today. Well, that's what you think. My body runs at a higher temperature. I actually think it's fair outside. Right? Those are subjective kinds of truths. Or chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream. I think that's an objective truth. But anyway, those are subjective truths, things that are true only for me. Right? So in the terms of morality, are they objective or subjective? And the moral argument basically leans on or lands on this, is that our world says morality is subjective. But nobody lives that way. We all live as if it's objective. Because the minute it's subjective, right and wrong is what I think, we just can't live that way. It can't even be what society thinks, because what society thinks changes? Or which society, right? It can't even be, and there are kind of atheistic arguments towards objective morality like utilitarianism. Well, it's ultimately what leads to the best for the maximal good, right? The greatest good for the greatest number, that's what's good, right? Okay, well, what about for the least, right? What can be justified for the sake of the greater good at the expense of the less or the least? That doesn't fly in our culture at all anymore. Who's good? Right? Those are the kinds of subjective problems that run in when we try to make morality subjective and deny that it's true. What right and wrong is true for all people in all places in all time, but the only way that can be possible is if the standard of good by which we all measure good or evil or right or wrong is outside of us. And again, morality is a function of persons, not of matter or material. So that's the kind of the framework for the moral argument. All right. I'm going to close that chapter. Sorry, we're moving so fast. And I'm going to hand out the second note pack. Yeah, would you mind on that side there? And could you maybe, thanks. Note pack 2 is what you should be getting. If it's not, let me know. So those are examples of predominantly the first step of a classical approach to apologetics, of trying to determine or establish the existence of God. But then at some point we want to move beyond a God exists to presenting Jesus. And of course, the very center of the Christian faith is the fact that we have a Savior. Oh, sorry, are we out? Okay. Oh. Yes? Yes. Oh, no, we printed enough for everyone. Did you guys get one? Okay, there's some extras here if you need. All right, everyone have one? Okay. At some point, we want to get to the discussion of Jesus and presenting Jesus and defending Christ as true. One of the, I suppose, I'm not going to use the word best, but a well-known and a well-worn and an important historical apologetic for the Christian faith comes from defending the resurrection of Jesus. And maybe I would say that this is one of the most important historical apologetics because our faith hinges on the fact of Jesus' resurrection, right? As Paul said in Colossians 15, if Christ hasn't raised, then our faith is not worth anything. This may or may not be something you can deliver in a conversation with someone. Maybe you never will. I have yet to have a conversation where someone let me go through this entire defense. But I have delivered this in the context of church settings. In fact, I even did a sermonized version of this for an Easter message once. And I had a woman come up afterwards who said, I was this close to chucking my faith. I was really just feeling like this is just, I'm just going through the motions. This is just blind belief. But when she was presented with the good historical evidence for the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, it changed things for her. I was delighted. So again, maybe that speaks to the benefit of apologetics in that it not only helps us respond, but it helps us respond to ourselves and some of the doubts or the concerns that we may have ourselves and some of the reassurance that we need that in fact our faith is true. Okay, the resurrection of Jesus is vital to our faith. And so what I want to work through is this is actually a defense developed by Gary Habermas from Trinity University. He's probably one of the leading expert scholars in the area of defending the historicity of the resurrection, also in defending miracles. So he's just I think he's a great resource for the church. But here is his defense of Jesus' resurrection in his 12-point defense. He and also Mike Lacona is another great, more recent and popular speaker and writer on this subject. Since he's developed this, they've both kind of come to what they call a minimal defense, where they've watered this down or whittled it down to 5 factors from history. I'm going to give you all 12, but some of them I'll focus on a little bit more than others, because some of them I think are stronger than others. But this is evidence for Jesus' resurrection from the historical record, right? So when we're saying evidence, we're saying, well, we're appealing to something that's objective. We're appealing to evidences that we possess primarily from the historical record. textual evidence, evidence from writings in history. Of course, much of that is the New Testament, but not all of it. The first thing that the historical record establishes is that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. I'm going to jump over Paul for a second here, because Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is absolutely vital, but I'm going to jump over him here because I want to touch down on him at another point. And I'll just move to, well, we can begin with Paul. The fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, actually, we don't even need the Bible to demonstrate that. We have that evidence recorded in the extra-biblical record of history. I've given you 4 examples of some writers from antiquity. These are writers from contemporaries with Jesus and the apostles. Tacitus was a Roman historian. He lived between 56 and 117 AD, and he wrote a number of pieces of history. In his work, The Annals, he writes this in chapter 15, verse 44, paragraph 44. He refers to Jesus. He says, Christus, from whom the name, and what the name he's referring to is the name of the sect that they're kind of debating, this problem. Christianity was a problem for the Romans. The name from whom, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. What F.F. Bruce points out, which is helpful to remember too, is that all of these writers actually, but Tacitus is no friend to Christianity, right? We actually have good evidence from Christianity's opponents. Tacitus is a Roman, and his posture towards Christianity, Bruce points out, is contemptuous and hostile. So it's safe to say that the source material that Tacitus was referring to as he was writing his work to record this event in time where under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius when Christ was crucified, he's not leaning on Christian source material. He's not referring to the New Testament. Jesus made his way into the Roman record books. That's essentially what's happened. Josephus is another notable character. He was a Jewish historian, again, contemporary with the apostles. A Jewish historian, but he was writing to a Roman audience. He was writing a history of the Jews for a Roman audience. And in his book, The Antiquities, he's writing a number of parts of their history, their contemporary history. And he, now speaking about the reign of Pilate, while he was governor of Judea, Josephus writes, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man. And when Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. Josephus is a really important source. If you go into many Christian sources and read this quote, there's actually more here. There's a point at which Josephus speaks to, and he rose, and the Christians follow him still to this day after he rose from the dead. There's belief that, and I think they're probably right, that some well-meaning Christians in history added some lines to Josephus's writing because it was just such an opportunity for another witness to Christ. Josephus was a Jew. He would have had no love for Christians. He would certainly not have, in a history of the Jews for the Romans, he would not have affirmed the resurrection of Jesus. So what I've concluded here is what most scholars believe is the original rendering of his quote, including what he did include, which isn't nothing, right? He's bearing, again, witness to the events that we know from our New Testament, that Jesus was crucified under Pilate. The Talmud is another, and I think you have most of it there. I don't have time to go into all of that, as well as Lucian of Samosata, a little bit later, a 2nd century Greek satirical writer. But what I think is interesting about Lucian is that his observations are of the Christians of his contemporary period, and he's describing what they're like. And in that, he's describing how, the lore of the Christians who still worship the man who was crucified in Palestine, because he introduced their cult into the world. And he says the poor wretches have convinced themselves, first and foremost, that they're going to be immortal and live for all time, and in consequence of which they despise death and even willingly give themselves into custody. He said, furthermore, their first lawgiver persuaded them that they are all brothers of one another after they've transgressed once for all by denying the Greek gods and by worshiping that crucified sophist himself and living under his laws. He doesn't like the church. He doesn't like Christians. He thinks they're stupid. But what's wonderful is that what he's describing is the very picture of the church that we've been past. Right? Yeah, that's exactly what the church was like. No, they didn't like it. But that's exactly who they were, and that's exactly what they were doing. And yes, we were worshiping Jesus, the crucified Savior. Okay, so that's from outside the Bible itself. We have evidence, textual evidence, that Jesus was crucified, in fact, under Pontius Pilate. The second piece that Habermas points out is that Jesus was buried. And again, these are all attested in the Gospels, but importantly also attested by Paul. That then the third point being that Jesus' death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope, believing his life had ended. John records that the disciples were hiding. They were locked behind the doors for fear of the Jews. Luke records that the disciples on the road to Emmaus had clear disillusionment over the events of Jesus' death. They did not expect Jesus, who they believed was his Messiah, to die. So they were bewildered. That was the state of the apostles or the disciples after Jesus died. They were in despair. And Luke presents Jesus' resurrection then as a complete surprise to the women who went to the grave, right? And then to the 11 and to Peter and to the 2 on the road and again to the disciples in the upper room. The clear record of the Gospels concerning the disciples' view on Jesus' death is that they weren't expecting it. And it completely ended their hope in Jesus' messianic mission. It was over. And they believed his death was final. So one thing that historians note is that the principle of embarrassment really weighs heavily toward the authenticity of the gospel records. Because if you want to invent a religion built on a number of leaders who would lead it forward, you will paint them in the best possible light you can. But the disciples were painted in anything but. The principle of embarrassment is that they were shown for who they were. They were frail people who didn't understand Jesus' mission and purpose. They were frightened and scared, and they ran, and all of that changed. Because of the resurrection. Number 4, that Jesus' tomb was found to be empty just a few days later. All 4 Gospels give the same account. The events initially reported by women, which again confirms to that the idea that the report was not invented. Again, the skeptic would say, oh, they just made that up. In the first century, in Israel, if you were going to make up an account of eyewitnesses bearing witness to something spectacular that happened, and you wanted that account to have credibility, I'm sorry to say this, we don't think this way, but this is the first century. If that were the case, you would not have included women as witnesses. In Israel, they weren't allowed to give witness or testimony in court, right? The testimony of a woman was not considered reliable in the first century. But the fact that the gospel records have the women as the first ones points to its authenticity. If they were making it up, they wouldn't have put that in. The reason they put that in is because that's the way it happened, because it actually did. So the principle of embarrassment weighs heavily. N.T. Wright points this out, and he summarizes well, I think. In his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is about this thick, but it's a great read. If they could have invented stories of fine, upstanding, reliable male witnesses being first at the tomb, they would have done it. That they did not tells us either that everyone in the early church knew that the women, led by Mary Magdalene, were in fact the first on the scene, or that the early church was not so inventive as critics have routinely imagined, or both. Would the other evangelists have been so slavishly foolish as to copy the stories unless they were convinced that, despite being an apologetic liability, it was historically trustworthy? I think he's right. All right. Next on our list was, just again confirming in support of the fact that the tomb was empty. So we have the gospel records. We have the principle of embarrassment. That Christianity was birthed in Jerusalem is also significant. Where Jesus was buried indicates that the tomb was vacated. Because if they all started running around saying Jesus is risen from the dead, right, and the tomb wasn't empty, what could have quickly happened? Someone had gone down to the tomb, right, said, he's right here. These people are lying, right? Also, the empty tomb is implied in pre-Pauline creeds. And I'm going to get to that in a second. Also, Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, somewhere around the middle of the 2nd century, in chapter 108, he records a letter that was being circulated at that time by the Jews. And he says this, here's what the letter says, he's speaking to Trypho. A godless and lawless heresy had sprung up from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified, this is the Jews speaking, but his disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now they deceive men by asserting that he is risen from the dead and ascended to heaven. Okay. So the Jews were denying, they were saying that the disciples came and stole Jesus' body, not that he rose from the dead. So obviously they're not supporting the resurrection, but what are they supporting? The empty tomb. See, some of our best apologetic evidence comes from Christianity's opponents in terms of testifying to the facts. Okay, number 5, the disciples had experiences they actually believed to be literal appearances of Jesus raised from the dead. Again, I'm going to park on Paul for a moment here. There's some corroboration from Tacitus as well in terms of the circumstances, but here's where Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is such a crucial text and such a crucial witness. In 1 Corinthians 15, all critical scholars will give us Paul in 1 Corinthians. He wrote it sometime in around 54 AD, right? So we know this is Paul's letter. No one disputes that. And in his letter, Paul, in chapter 15, he writes to the church and says, I passed on to you that which is of what I received, that which is of first importance. Paul is passing on to the early Christians, or the Christians in Corinth, the outline, the sketch of the gospel, that Christ died according to Scriptures, that he was buried, that he raised according to Scriptures, then he appeared, and he lists where he appeared. Textual scholars look at Paul's wording, and the word phrasing he uses, what I received, I passed on to you, very much reflects a rabbinic tradition of disciple or learner and teacher, right? Remember that the rabbinic schools, the Jewish schools of learning, were fundamentally or primarily oral, right? Jesus was an oral teacher. Much teaching in the first century was oral, and this is true in the first century church as well. That Paul is saying that he actually received this tradition, and now he's passing it on to the Corinthians. And what he received, now also scholars point out, absolutely resembles an early Christian creed. Like a creed is simply a formalized set of beliefs or statements that kind of encapsulate our belief system or belief set. That Christ died according to Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, etc. So Paul is for the Corinthians laying out a creed that he received and that he now is passing on to them, which is of the utmost importance. In other words, here's the core of our faith, right? Ultimately grounded and rooted in the resurrection, which he develops further on in chapter 15. But in saying what I received, I've passed on to you, Paul is bearing witness to the fact that, okay, so he received this at some point. At some point, someone gave this to him. Now we go back into the book of Acts and we look at Paul's testimony in life, right? And in Acts chapter 9, we come to Paul's Damascus Road experience where Christ confronts him. There's there's a range. Scholars would give a range in terms of time, how many years after Jesus rose from the dead. Most scholars would say at minimum 3, at most 6. So between 3 and 6 years from Christ's resurrection, Paul is confronted by Jesus and becomes a follower of Christ, right? And then in Galatians, he tells us that after this occurred, he went up to Jerusalem, and there he spent some time, and then he went out preaching for probably about 3 years. And then he came back after that and met with Peter and James, he says, those reputed pillars of the faith. And there they confirmed that, yes, in fact, the gospel he was proclaiming was the gospel, and that, blessings on you, Paul, as you do your work. So, somewhere between 3 to 6 years, or 3 to 7 years of the resurrection, Paul is receiving a formal, already accepted Christian creed that Christ died, that he was buried, that he was raised according to the scriptures, right? So Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is actually bearing eyewitness testimony to within, at best, 3, probably closer to 6, between 6 and 9 years from Jesus' resurrection. The time frame, it becomes so short in terms of eyewitness testimony. Bearing witness to, which is the 5th point, that the disciples had experiences they actually believed to be the literal appearances of Jesus raised from the dead. It affirms that Paul has received this gospel tradition from the apostles. And in addition, Paul confirms that he was aware of the other apostles' testimony about seeing Jesus alive, and he agreed with their validity and the centrality of that testimony to their gospel. So much so that Paul can say in 1 Corinthians 15, and if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. More than that, we are then found to be false witnesses about God. If we have said that Jesus rose from the dead and he hasn't, then we are false witnesses, because that's what we are bearing witness to. I won't take time to look at, I think the Tacitus quote is in your notes. Yep, you can read over that. But what Tacitus just provides us is an extra-biblical account of reading a pattern of what we understand. Why did the death of Jesus seem to stop that movement, but then it broke out again, inexplicably? Why was that? Well, they could come up with their own reasons, but we know why. Right? Number 6, the disciples were transformed from doubters, afraid to identify with Jesus, to bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection, willing to die to uphold their message. Acts 2 is a complete reversal of the gospel accounts of the disciples. Right? The gospel accounts of the disciples is embarrassing until Acts 2 and the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost, and suddenly they are bold. Suddenly they're emboldened to proclaim, and what they're proclaiming over and over and over and over and over again is that Christ rose from the dead. Number 7, this resurrection message was central to the preaching of the early church. And again, I've kind of left you, I've highlighted all the texts there, the gospel one certainly, but in the book of Acts, it's just wonderful if you go through and read those texts in succession and over again. And we are witnesses to this fact, and we've witnessed it. And we're here to tell you we witnessed these things over and over again. N.T. Wright, I don't think I've got his quote here, but I remember writing this in one of my papers. N.T. Wright basically said it this way. He said, the resurrection of Jesus was not crucial to the message of the disciples. It was their message. That was their gospel, that Christ had risen from the dead. Okay, number 8, it was especially proclaimed in Jerusalem, where Jesus died and was buried only a short time before. And again, this is critical when just thinking about the context of the resurrection. It all happened in Jerusalem, right? Pentecost occurred in Jerusalem. The church began to grow in Jerusalem, where the disciples were proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. It had all happened there, right? Where people witnessed these things. And if people wanted to falsify what the disciples were saying, that was the opportunity to do it because they would have had the evidence. They could have found the body. They could have found other witnesses. So it was especially important that this was happening in Jerusalem. Number 9, as a result of the preaching of the resurrection, the church was born and grew. Again, see Acts 2, verse 41. Sunday became the first day of the week, which became the primary day of worship, especially powerful considering that the earliest believers were all Jewish. These are now becoming, I think, important footnotes, but to me less compelling. But it is interesting that all of the early Christians were Jews, or almost all of them. And yet, as followers of Jesus, it was their decision to move their day of worship from Sabbath, as the Jews would, to Sunday morning, which was when Jesus rose. To me, that's not a slam dunk. That's interesting, but not a slam dunk. Number 11, to me, is more compelling. James, the brother of Jesus and former skeptic, was converted to faith when he also saw what he believed to be the resurrected Jesus. And here back to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is so critical that he appeared to, first of all, Peter, then to the 12, then to like 500 others, and then to James, his brother, who Mark and John record for us was among his family members who thought Jesus was out of his gourd, right? They wanted to get Jesus and restrain him. And then James becomes actually the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and eventually he's martyred. And this is recorded by Josephus again in Antiquities at the hand of the high priest Ananus the younger. James, the brother of Jesus, is put to death. And lastly, number 12, a few years later, Paul likewise was converted by what he believed to be an appearance of the risen Christ. And Paul also is a really important piece of evidence in that Paul, as an Orthodox Jew, a zealous Jew, an educated Jew, he believed he was doing God's work as part of God's people, Israel, in squelching this sect of Christianity that was distorting the prophecies of Messiah and defaming the name of Yahweh. He was doing God's work by persecuting the Christians. And then all of a sudden, he becomes their greatest missionary ever. Right? How could that be? You can't argue for that he's not intelligent on either end. Something happened to Paul, and of course, the record and his own testimony is that he encountered the risen Christ, and that changed everything. Okay, that was like a speedy version. Yeah, Chris?
What you didn't mention the body, it's linked, but you didn't mention explicitly the body. They never found the body. You mentioned the empty tomb.
Right.
What about, does that factor into these 12, missing body?
It's implied in the empty tomb that no body was found. Yeah, but no, Habermas doesn't. I mean, it's not one of their historical pieces that no body was found, but it's implied because the argument is he rose from the dead, right? Okay, is it time for a break again? One of my former pastors used to say, when you get over the hill, you start picking up speed. And I feel like time's going faster for me all the time. That was quick. Okay, so we'll break, and then we're coming back for the practicum. Okay. Yes. Okay, so now it's putting you to work. This is great. I've been looking forward to this hour. Actually, we don't quite have an hour. I think we have about. I think in all you'll have about 25 minutes just to do a bit of a practical exercise. And I don't know how you'll break up, but into maybe to some small groups, and you can go and find a corner to discuss together. What I thought would be fun. My ideas of fun. Hey, you're a fun guy. So the exercise, I thought, okay, so, and I realized we worked through that pretty quickly, but hopefully gave you at least some launch points for, okay, here's where we can appeal to reasons to give for the historicity, the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, but also to be able to use that in response to, I guess, alternate theories that would want to debunk it, and there are many. And so, on the second last page of your course pack, your pack number 2, note pack 2, is the exercise. And so, what I've written there is that realizing, anybody can be skeptical, and you can't prevent someone from being skeptical, and can assert an alternate theory, But I think we want to encourage people, as even in witness, that let's try to be as honest as we can. Anybody can be skeptical. I'm telling you what I believe, but I want to also share the reasons why. You can tell me that you're skeptical, but I think to be intellectually honest, you need to give me some reasons why you're skeptical. So in light of this, consider some of the following attempts to discredit Jesus' resurrection. These are alternate resurrection theories. How might you use then some of the evidence we've discussed to respond graciously and intelligently to alternate theories? Include in your thought or a response thoughtful questions you might ask the skeptic as part of your defense. And I think part of good witness is not just to ream off all the answers we have, but to also help the person we're talking to challenge their own assumptions, to ask questions of themselves. So maybe you can think of some questions to ask. So here are some alternate theories. And so I think probably the best thing to do would be to choose one as a possibility. Okay, let's say you're talking with someone, I don't know who or whom. You're talking with someone, and the resurrection comes up, and they say, for instance, you know what, I just think the disciples went to the wrong tomb. They found an empty tomb, and it was the wrong one. And that's what happened. Jesus was in the other tomb. Okay. That's the unknown tomb theory, or the wrong tomb theory. There's a legend theory, the idea that the apostles or the disciples fabricated the resurrection much later on. Like when the Gospels were being written, they kind of wrote back into history because they wanted to vindicate Jesus, in his memory or whatever. There's the twin theory, that Jesus had a twin brother no one knew about. There's the theory of hallucination, that the disciples actually hallucinated their experience of Jesus. Rudolf Bultmann's, I'm going to skip over that. Existential resurrection theory, that Jesus just rose in our hearts. The spiritual resurrection theory, that Jesus appeared as a risen spirit, but he wasn't actually an embodied person. There's a theory that the disciples stole the body. Of course, the Jews were purporting that one. Or the authorities hid the body. The swoon theory is another one, the idea that they didn't check Jesus' pulse when they took him off the cross. He was actually still living. They wrapped him up, and in the cool of the tomb, with some rest, he revived and managed to. Yeah. Number 10, I'll just put, this one's in there because it's actually, don't choose this one. It's too easy to respond to. Jesus was an alien. Okay, so there's the assignment, or there's the practicum. So break into groups. Is it table groups? Chris, how does that work usually?
We usually try to encourage them to meet with other people from other churches and things like that they don't always connect with. But,
all right, so you've all done this before, the breaking of you know what you're doing. So find yourself a group, maybe some people.
And maybe some of our visitors, although we kind of already have a little group over here, could integrate with some of the people as well, who are Barnabas students.
And so are we going to spread out in this room, or can we go to other parts of the church? Or?
There's another room over here.
Okay.
Oh, there's rooms in the
Okay.
So we could probably have 3 in here and then
Okay.
2
L-
other rooms.
All right. Let's do that then. Choose one, and together come up with the best response. On some of the material we've talked about. You might have some of your own ideas too. That's okay. And then we'll just come back together.
15 minutes
Yep.
and come back. We'll try to 5 or so to share your group answers.
Yeah. Okay. So go. Okay. Hopefully you had some fun with that. Seemed to be a lot of good conversation. Um, let's just hear maybe in just a brief summary. Give us what kind of response did you come up with in your group for? First, I guess state here we tackled this response, and here were some of the points we made in reaction to that. So can we start on this end here and Dave?
Chose the wrong tomb theory.
Okay, wrong tomb theory.
We gave 3 reasons for that.
Okay,
First of all, the tomb was owned by Joseph of Arimaeus, and he would have been, probably a wealthy, well-known individual. So word would spread to the fact that this tomb was being used.
great.
Secondly, when Jesus was taken down from the cross and moved towards the tomb, a lot of his followers probably would have followed, maybe at a distance, but they would have known.
Mhm.
Plus, it was obvious Mary knew where it was because Mary Magdalene, she went right directly to the tomb. The Bible doesn't say that she searched, for a tomb,
Right.
and so the wrong tomb theory,
Yep.
doesn't really hold water at all.
Okay, good. Yeah, really, that's great. You're really drawing on a couple of the variables that we talked about, which really, the fact that it's anchored in a locality where people lived. Good point on Joseph of Arimathea. The fact that the grave owner is named is very relevant. Yeah, it just helps to anchor it in reality. It's not like just this kind of poetic sort of description, right? It's they're naming places, they're naming people. That's great. Very good. Okay, you're the spokesperson. Okay, congratulations.
Okay, so we chose the legend theory.
Okay.
Resurrection was a fabrication created much later by followers who wanted to vindicate a leader who died long ago.
Mhm.
First and foremost, there are numerous, hundreds of examples of Jesus appearing within days
Mhm.
of his crucifixion.
Okay.
So that's one way, one defense.
Mhm.
A second one was it couldn't have been made up because the Gospels were written within a generation.
Okay. Okay.
And we had a little help that why it would be culturally irrelevant for Greeks or anybody to want to talk about resurrection because the body was considered bad.
Sorry.
Why would you want to resurrect a body?
Oh.
The body is considered evil by Greeks.
Okay.
And some of the questions we felt we could ask was, why would people wait such a long time? After you wait such a long time, how is it that all the stories were exactly consistent and they all said the same thing?
Mhm.
That's just impossible when you wait such a long, long time because people forget things. People forget facts.
And yet, so what you're saying is, and yet the like particularly the Gospels present, while different in their perspective, they present a consistent emphasis on Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Okay.
And the last thought was, how do you explain people who are fearful and hiding and going back to their old professions and suddenly becoming bold and proclaiming and being willing to die?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point. Legends are nice to believe in, I suppose, but they hardly compel you to martyrdom. Yeah. Great. Okay, very good. Center group here, this group.
Yeah, so the center group here, we chose the swoon theory. Just
Oh, good.
a few points to note. So one thing that I've been kind of personally wrestling in, we talked about this amongst the team, was oftentimes people will just make statements. And so it's, in a friendly way, we can always ask people, what are your sources? Like, what sources are you consulting? Especially with like social media, people pass stuff along, but there's no link, there's no source.
Yeah.
So we need to, in a friendly way, challenge people, and then it's incumbent on us as well. Like, if we're gonna make statements, we should at least be familiar with the sources that we're consulting. We can't just
Mhm.
do the same thing.
Mhm.
Another thing that we just talked about as well is that the swoon theory is interesting because there's actually a lot of common ground. Like when we're having an argument, well, not argument, when we're arguing with someone, we should consider what common ground do we have between us. So in the swoon theory, the common ground is that both individuals agree that there was a crucifixion.
Mhm.
Both individuals agree that there was an empty tomb, and they agree that Christ was seen after the resurrection. The
Good.
only really thing you're disagreeing on is whether he died or not.
Yeah.
But you agree on quite a bit.
Good.
That being said, once you've established that common ground, you can ask questions. You can ask, are you familiar with how effective the Roman soldiers were when it came to crucifixion? Are there any documented instances where someone survived a crucifixion? If Jesus did appear after, why doesn't it talk about in the Bible what his condition was? He would have been in pretty bad physical shape after.
Mhm.
If he was a celebrity before the crucifixion, he would have elevated status after the crucifixion because you just survived a Roman crucifixion. And yet, after this celebrity status would have increased, like why did he just disappear? How do you explain the ascension? So the more you kind of pick at it, the theory starts to fall apart. So just kind of where.
Okay. I'm convinced. Yeah. Good. Good. No, great. Excellent. I especially appreciate the start where we can find common ground, because that immediately disarms. And then asking questions is always a great way to disarm in a conversation, rather than it being point counterpoint, right? Set match. Yeah, great, very good. Okay, was it this the back? Okay, back.
We basically had also had a look at the alternate empty tomb theory.
Mhm.
There was a certain fact that the people said that they saw where they laid him in the scriptures.
Yeah.
That was one fact that was there. The other thing is there would have been a big red flag, which were the Roman soldiers, which were guarding the tomb.
Mm-hmm.
The third thing that came up was the seals that they put on the tomb as well,
Mm-hmm.
which basically told them nobody can touch it.
Yeah.
Whereas the guards were actually put on a duress of death if they failed their duties.
Mm-hmm.
That's another argument you could bring if you say that. But
Great.
that's what came up, and
Yeah.
I stand under correction for everything else. So.
Yeah. No. Great. Yeah. And again, rooting it in the local aspect, right, or the geographical aspect, that it was in the vicinity that people knew. So the Jews knew where it was because they put guards on it. So if the disciples just got the wrong tomb and started the resurrection rumor, all the Jews needed to do was go to the right tomb and produce a body. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Good. Okay, was it one group here or okay.
So we chose the disciples stole the body of Jesus.
Mhm.
And so a few of the different points were just the scriptural accounts of the number of resurrections. There's no any of the 500 people that claim that he rose from the dead, and none of them ever recanted on that. Well, actually, he never did. We just stole the body, which is pretty remarkable if that actually was able to happen.
Mhm.
The other aspect is the fact that disciples didn't go anywhere. First thing they do is the crime scene. There's no record of them leaving.
Right.
And then even there's other accounts, extra biblical historians that are clear that Jesus was crucified, but there's no accounts of there being a massive search for the body,
Mhm.
which probably would have happened if they actually believed his body had been stolen.
Yeah.
And then also touching on the women being testimonies
Mhm.
is unusual,
Mhm.
as you pointed out. Why
Yep.
would you have women be the first ones to say that he's risen? That wouldn't make sense in the culture.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the main
Good.
one.
No, that's good.
And like
Right.
to die for the fact that Jesus rose from the dead.
Right. I was about to just say, and you've hit on that. You really leaned into, and I think that's rightly so. You leaned into the psychology of the disciples. How do you explain these people who were fishermen, carpenter, simple people, and they were terrified because Jesus died? How do you explain the total reversal? Right. Okay, they stole the body, and then they became emboldened to take on the Jewish establishment and even go to their deaths. Doesn't quite fit the facts.
Well, and then you do have the Roman soldiers as well. If they fall asleep at the tomb, they're probably being executed. Roman culture, when it came to soldiers doing their duty, was extremely harsh.
Yeah.
And then also there's no evidence of any kind of a fight happening at the tomb.
Right.
Which, if you go to steal the body and you have probably at the time the best soldiers in the known world guarding the tomb,
Yeah.
there's probably going to be evidence of a struggle to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Yeah, especially if they'd killed a couple Roman soldiers in the process. Great. Okay. That was 5? Okay, great. Well, it gives you a taste. It's not it doesn't come naturally. It doesn't come easily. There's work involved. But hopefully this has just kind of whet your appetite and hopefully given you at least maybe some exposure to some of the broader sources. There's a lot, right, that we can draw on. There's just a wealth of material that we have access to in our day and age to draw on to deepen our confidence in and our ability to give a good answer. So hopefully this has helped you. Just open a door is an introduction. So it's exactly done that. It's introduced you to a field of study that maybe wasn't as familiar. Hopefully this has helped to do it and put a good general resource in your library to start. Hopefully you can build off of. And and it was nice to spend this time with you. So